bones grind together with a sickening crunch. Oxygen vents scream in the background, masking the sharp intake of breath from a mechanic who just wrapped duct tape around a compound fracture. To the galaxy's elite trauma surgeons watching through the monitors, this wasn't survival. It was a biological impossibility. Cole Bennett did not wake up with a gasp. There was no sudden, heroic return to consciousness. He surfaced from the dark like a drowning man clawing through thick mud, entirely against his will. The first thing he registered was the smell. Ozone, melted copper, the unmistakable, nauseating stench of scorched biological matter, probably his own hair. He opened one eye. The other was glued shut by something thick and drying. He didn't want to know what it was. The deck plating beneath his cheek was freezing, vibrating with a rapid, uneven, mechanical stutter that meant the orbital refinery's primary grav drives were chewing themselves to pieces. Cole spat a mouthful of grit onto the grated floor. It tasted like an old battery. "Son of a bitch," he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the blaring klaxons. He tried to push himself up. His right arm responded perfectly, planting against the deck. His left arm didn't. Instead of holding his weight, the limb buckled with the wet, structural integrity of a soaked sponge. Cole collapsed hard, his chin cracking against the steel grate. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through him. He rolled onto his back, dragging his left arm across his chest to look at it. The heavy canvas of his coveralls was torn. Halfway between his wrist and his elbow, the forearm bowed at an impossible, sickening angle. A jagged edge of bone, slick and white, had punched through the skin and muscle, catching the pale blue light of the emergency strobes. He stared at it. His brain refused to accept the telemetry it was receiving. It was a detached, almost academic observation. That is a piece of my skeleton. It belongs on the inside. Then the pain hit. It wasn't a sharp sting. It was a dense, suffocating, crushing sensation, like a vice clamping down on his marrow. Cole curled into a tight ball, his breath coming in short, ragged hiccups. He didn't scream. He just squeezed his eyes shut and waited for the sheer intensity of the agony to knock him back out. It didn't. Humanity's evolutionary ancestors hadn't survived the savannas by passing out when a predator took a bite. The pain spiked, plateaued, and then, slowly, a cold, shivering clarity washed over him. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His hands began to shake. Adrenaline, that ancient toxic sludge of survival, flooded his system. 500,000 miles away, in the pristine, lavender-scented observation deck of the medical rescue frigate Aegis, two xenomedical specialists stared at the telemetry feeds in absolute horrified silence. The Universal Translation Matrix, a quirk of interstellar diplomacy, assigned the avian-descended observers the names Carter and Hayes. It made their clicking, whistling language palatable to the human crew they were assigned to monitor. But right now, Carter wasn't speaking. He was staring at the biometric readouts scrolling down the primary glass display. "This feed is corrupted," Carter said, his translated voice flat, artificial, and attempting to convey disbelief. He tapped a long, multi-jointed digit against the glass. Heart rate is 130 beats per standard minute. Blood pressure is escalating to a level that should burst his cranial vessels. And look at his neural pain receptors. The visual output is blinding. Hayes leaned closer, her own dark, unblinking eyes reflecting the flashing red warnings on the screen. "The feed is not corrupted. I am receiving live feed from his suit's internal mesh. He has suffered a catastrophic structural failure of the upper appendage, a complete fracture of the radius and ulna. The trauma shock alone should have induced cardiac arrest 3 minutes ago." "So why is he still moving?" Carter asked. On the screen, the security camera feed showed Cole Bennett doing something that made both alien medics recoil in visceral disgust. Cole had managed to drag himself to a tall bulkhead. He was panting, his face pale and slick with a greasy sweat. He reached up with his good right hand and pulled down a roll of heavy-duty industrial sealant tape, the kind used to patch atmospheric leaks on exterior hull plating. "I hate this job," Cole muttered, his breath hitching. "I genuinely deeply hate this job." He bit the end of the tape, tearing a long strip free. He looked down at the bone protruding from his arm. His stomach heaved. He dry heaved, tasting bile, swallowing it back down. He couldn't set the bone. If he tried to pull it, he knew he would pass out. So, he bypassed the medical reality entirely. He grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the floor, laid it against the warped angle of his forearm, and began tightly wrapping the tape around his skin, the bone, and the metal. On the Aegis, Hayes let out a high-pitched trill of distress. He is sealing the open wound with unsterilized chemical adhesives. He's compressing a compound fracture without anesthetic. The localized agony must be paralyzing. Carter watched, paralyzed himself. His species. They do not have a biological shutdown mechanism. The pain does not stop them. It only agitates them. Cole finished the makeshift splint, biting off the tape and spitting the scrap away. He tested the arm. It hung heavily at his side, a throbbing, useless club of tape and steel. Every time his pulse beat, the wound flared with hot, sickening pressure. But it wasn't flopping around anymore. He leaned his head back against the bulkhead, closing his eyes. The station groaned around him. The deep, bass-heavy rumble of the primary coolant system failing vibrated through his boots. If the coolant didn't reach the reactor in Sector 4 within the next 20 minutes, the entire refinery was going to vaporize, taking Cole and the 300 other miners trapped in the lower hab blocks with it. "Right," Cole grunted, opening his eyes. He forced himself to his feet. His knees wobbled, threatening to betray him, but he locked them out. Sector 4. Walk. The corridors of the Ouroboros refinery were a labyrinth of utilitarian design. Grey walls, exposed piping, and low ceilings. Now they were a war zone. Emergency blast doors had dropped in random sections, forcing Cole to take the maintenance crawlways. He dragged his left leg slightly. He hadn't noticed it at first, blinded by the fireworks in his shattered arm, but his right thigh was burning. It felt like someone had driven a hot fire poker into the meat of his leg and left it there to cool. He leaned against a humming data stack in server room B, gasping for breath. The air here was thin, the scrubbers clearly failing. His lungs burned with every pull. He looked down. A piece of jagged, twisted plasteel, roughly the size of a large knife blade, was buried deep in his outer thigh. Dark, thick crimson was pooling around the entry wound, soaking the heavy fabric of his pants and dripping steadily onto the grated floor. "Perfect," Cole rasped. "Just perfect." He reached a trembling hand down to touch the metal. The moment his fingers brushed the shrapnel, a jolt of electricity shot up his spine, making his teeth click together. The muscle was seizing around the foreign object. If he walked with it in, the jagged edges would shred the femoral artery. If he pulled it out, he might bleed to death. He didn't have the luxury of a prolonged medical debate. He had 12 minutes before the reactor melted through the floorboards. "His blood loss is exceeding acceptable survival parameters," Hayes reported. Her voice pitched an octave higher than usual. She was pacing the deck of the triage bay, her fragile, hollow bones aching just in sympathy. "The laceration is deep. If he removes the obstruction, he will exsanguinate." Carter was typing frantically on his console, trying to interface with the Ouroboros automated medical bays. "I am trying to deploy a medical drone, but the automated bulkheads are sealed. He is entirely cut off. Hayes, look at his endocrine readouts. What is happening to his brain?" Hayes stopped pacing and stared at the secondary monitor. Complex web of chemical formulas was cascading across the screen. "Epinephrine," she whispered. "Norepinephrine, dopamine, endorphins. His adrenal glands are dumping lethal amounts of stimulants directly into his bloodstream. It's a chemical cocktail that would cause massive neural degradation in any of the civilized species. His body is poisoning itself to stay awake." "He isn't just staying awake," Carter said, a profound sense of dread creeping into his tone. "He is preparing to operate on himself." Cole looked around the server room. He spotted a fire suppression station on the wall. Next to it, A heavy, grease-stained rag hung from a pipe. He limped over, grabbed the rag and shoved it into his mouth, biting down hard on the sour-tasting cloth. He gripped the protruding plasteel with his good right hand. His breath came in ragged, hyperventilating snorts through his nose. His brain screamed at him to stop, to lie down, to just go to sleep and let the cold dark take over. If you don't turn that valve, Cole thought, his mind a cynical, narrow tunnel of focus, the company is going to deny your widow the pension for negligence. You are not dying on company time. He didn't pull it slowly. Slowly was for movies. Slowly gave the brain time to process the horror. Cole jerked his hand backward with explosive force. The sound it made was awful, a wet, suctioning schlick of metal tearing through muscle fibers and fat. Cole's eyes rolled back in his head. A muffled, guttural scream tore through the greasy rag in his mouth. His knees gave out entirely and he crashed onto the floor, dropping the bloody plasteel. The pain was absolute. It was a white-hot, blinding light that erased the room, the station, and his own name for 3 agonizing seconds. He lay on his side, his chest heaving, sweat pouring off his forehead and stinging his eyes. He spat the rag out. It hit the floor with a wet slap. Gauze, he mumbled deliriously, his eyes scanning the room. Need pressure. He didn't have gauze. He had a welding torch on his tool belt. On the Aegis, Carter physically looked away from the monitor. No, he cannot. The psychological trauma alone. Hayes didn't look away. She couldn't. It was morbid, horrifying fascination. He's going to cauterize it. Carter, we're watching a sentient creature butcher itself for locomotion. Cole unclipped the small butane torch. He flicked the igniter. A small, tight blue flame hissed to life. It sounded like a striking snake. He looked at the bleeding hole in his leg. The blood was pulsing, a steady rhythmic bubbling that warned him he had very little time. Fuck it, Cole breathed. He jammed the blue flame directly against the open wound. The smell of cooking meat hit his nose instantly, thick and sweet and deeply wrong. His vision went completely black. His jaw locked so tight he heard one of his molars crack. He held the flame there for 4 agonizingly long seconds, feeling the heat radiate down to the bone, searing the severed blood vessels shut. When he finally pulled the torch away, he didn't have the strength to turn it off. It clattered to the deck. Cole lay flat on his back, staring up at the flickering fluorescent light above him. His breathing was shallow. His skin was the color of dirty chalk. His heart rate is dropping, Carter said urgently. 80 beats, 70. The shock is finally overpowering the adrenal response. He is expiring. Hayes watched the vitals. The numbers dipped dangerously low. The human body had a limit. You could only burn the engine so hot before the pistons melted. The screen flashed yellow, then a pale warning red. Then, slowly, the numbers stabilized. 65 beats per minute. Steady, weak but steady. On the screen, the human let out a long rattling exhale. He rolled over onto his stomach, planted his good hand against the floor and dragged himself upward. He used the server rack to pull himself to his feet. He stood heavily, favoring his burned, mutilated leg, his taped-up broken arm hanging uselessly. He didn't look heroic. He looked like a corpse that hadn't gotten the memo. Cole wiped a smear of sweat and ash from his forehead, leaving a dark streak across his pale skin. He looked at the hallway leading to Sector 4. 3 minutes, he rasped, checking his cracked wrist chrono. Gotta hustle. He began to limp down the corridor. The temperature in Sector 4 was pushing 45 degrees Celsius. The air was thick with humidity, the atmosphere clouded by hissing jets of superheated steam escaping from microfractures in the primary coolant lines. The noise was deafening, a continuous high-pitched shrieking of pressurized gas that vibrated right in the center of Cole's skull. He leaned against the heavy blast door, dragging himself through the threshold. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. His leg throbbed with a dull, burning ache that radiated up into his hip. His arm was a constant, sharp punishment. Coolant valve, Cole muttered. his eyes squinting against the stinging steam. He spotted it. 50 feet away, mounted on the main feed line, was a massive industrial wheel. It was forged from heavy iron, coated in condensation and grime. It was designed to be turned by 2 men using a cheetah bar, or by an automated hydraulic servo motor. The servo motor was currently sparking, a blackened crater where its control panel used to be. Cole limped toward it, dragging his dead leg, stepping carefully over hissing floor vents. The heat was suffocating. His coveralls clung to his skin, saturated with cold sweat. He reached the valve. He grabbed the top of the iron wheel with his good right hand and pulled with all his remaining strength. His boots slipped on the wet grated floor. The wheel didn't budge a single millimeter. "Come on," Cole gasped, coughing as a plume of steam washed over him. He wiped his face, leaving a smear of grease across his cheek. He adjusted his stance, planted his feet as best he could without putting weight on the burned thigh, and yanked again. Nothing. The metal groaned, but the valve was seized. "He cannot actuate the mechanism," Carter stated from the sterile safety of the Aegis. The alien medic's voice was tinged with a strange, uncharacteristic pity. "The torque required exceeds his single-limb muscular capacity. He has pushed his biological limits past the breaking point, and it will end here. It is a tragic waste of endurance." Hayes watched the feed, her mandibles clicking nervously. "If he fails, the resulting thermal expansion will detonate the station's core. 312 human lives will be extinguished. Should we not attempt to contact him? To offer comfort? We cannot distract him. Look." Carter pointed at the screen. Cole had stopped pulling. He stood before the massive wheel, his head bowed, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy, exhausted breaths. He looked at his left arm, the taped, broken, useless appendage. The bone was still fractured beneath the tape. The muscles were torn. He looked at the wheel. Then he looked at his arm. "No," Cole whispered to himself in the empty, screaming room. "No, no, no. God, no!" He knew what he had to do. He hated the universe for making it the only option. Cole stepped closer to the wheel. He wedged his good right hand on the bottom, spoke. Then taking a deep, shuddering breath, he raised his left arm. He didn't use the hand, the nerves were dead, the fingers unresponsive. Instead, he shoved his forearm right where the broken bone was taped to the wrench, between the upper spokes of the heavy iron wheel. On the Aegis, Hayes let out a sharp cry and physically turned her back to the monitor. "He's using the fractured bone as a fulcrum. He will sever the limb entirely." Cole closed his eyes. He tasted blood in his mouth. He thought about the pension. He thought about the 300 miners playing cards in the hab block, blissfully unaware that the floor was about to become plasma. He thought about how much he wanted a cold beer. He threw his entire body weight forward, twisting his torso, using the broken arm as a structural lever. The agony was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't just pain. It was a physical sound in his head, a roaring static that drowned out the hissing steam. He felt the 2 halves of his broken radius grind against the steel wrench. He felt the torn muscle fibers ripping further, tearing away from the bone. A sound tore its way out of his throat, a wet, ugly, ragged scream. It wasn't a hero's battle cry. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, gnawing off its own foot to escape. It was raw, pathetic, and terrifying. "Turn, you absolute bastard!" Cole screamed, tears of pure agony streaming down his soot-stained face. Kriak. The wheel shifted. The rusted threads inside the massive pipe shrieked in protest, but the leverage of his trapped arm gave him the torque he needed. Cole didn't stop. He pushed harder, ignoring the sickening pop in his elbow, ignoring the warm rush of fresh blood soaking the duct tape. He pushed until his vision tunneled into a pinpoint of grey light. The wheel completed a quarter turn, then a half. Deep within the floorboards, the violent shaking of the deck began to subside. The high-pitched scream of the failing reactor shifted down an octave, then 2, settling back into a heavy rhythmic thrum. The flow of primary coolant had been restored. Cole immediately yanked his arm free from the spokes. He stumbled backward, losing his footing entirely, and crashed hard against the opposite bulkhead. He slid down the cool metal wall, his legs splaying out in front of him. His left arm lay in his lap, a ruined, bloody mess. He didn't look at it. He couldn't. The station was quiet now, save for the hum of machinery and the hiss of localized steam vents. Cole let his head loll back against the wall. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid twitches. With a trembling right hand, he reached into the breast pocket of his coveralls. His fingers fumbled, lacking coordination, but eventually they extracted a crushed, slightly damp cigarette and a cheap plastic lighter. It took him 3 tries to spark the flint. The small flame illuminated his pale, exhausted face. He lit the cigarette, took a deep drag, and blew a thin stream of grey smoke up toward the ceiling vents. "I'm taking tomorrow off," he whispered to the empty room. Aboard the Aegis, Carter and Hayes stood in stunned silence. The biometric readouts were a disaster: shock, severe blood loss, massive tissue trauma. Yet the human was conscious. He was resting. "Dispatch the heavy retrieval drone," Carter said, his voice quiet, filled with a newfound terrifying reverence, "and alert the medical staff." Hayes nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the man smoking against the bulkhead. "What triage protocol should I instruct them to prepare?" Carter looked at the readouts, then at the camera feed. "I do not know, Hayes. I do not think standard medicine applies to a species that refuses to accept when it is broken." The cigarette burned down to the filter, singeing the calloused skin of Cole's index finger. He didn't feel it. His head rested against the cold steel bulkhead, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle that echoed in the quiet machinery room. The heavy retrieval drone breached the sector doors with a pneumatic hiss. It was a sleek silver carapace hovering on repulsor lifts, entirely alien to the grimy utilitarian aesthetic of the Ouroboros refinery. Blue scanning lasers washed over Cole, mapping the catastrophic damage to his biology. Mechanical tendrils tipped with sterile stabilization pads extended from the drone's underbelly, gently wrapping around his torso and legs. Cole didn't fight it. He let the machine lift him, his head lolling sideways. The last thing he registered before the heavy blanket of unconsciousness finally suffocated him was the sterile, sharp smell of the drone's antiseptic field. It smelled like fake lemons. He hated fake lemons. 20 minutes later, the airlock of the medical frigate Aegis cycled with a soft chime. Dr. Carter and Dr. Hayes stood waiting in the primary trauma bay. The room was blindingly white, smelling of ozone and purified oxygen. To their avian-descended physiology, the temperature was a comfortable, balmy warmth. To a human, it would feel like a sauna. The drone floated in, depositing Cole onto the central diagnostic table. Up close, the human was a terrifying sight. His grey coveralls were saturated with a heavy drying crust of dark red. The smell hit Hayes first. A brutal, metallic copper tang mixed with the sickeningly sweet odour of cooked muscle tissue and old sweat. She clicked her mandibles in a frantic, involuntary rhythm, trying to suppress the prey instinct screaming in her hindbrain. "Begin the atmospheric scrub," Carter ordered, his translated voice sharp. "And get those garments off him. We need to assess the full extent of the localized trauma." Surgical lasers whined to life, cleanly slicing through the heavy canvas of Cole's uniform. As the fabric fell away, the monitors above the table erupted into a symphony of frantic chirping alarms. Carter stared at the shattered left arm. Up close, the makeshift splint was a masterpiece of desperation. The industrial duct tape was fused with dried blood, skin, and the steel wrench. The jagged edge of the radius bone still protruded, a dull ivory spike amidst angry, swollen purple flesh. "The structural damage is extensive," Carter murmured, his multi-jointed fingers hovering over a laser scalpel. "The bone is fragmented in 4 places. The surrounding muscle tissue is severely torn. How he applied sufficient torque to the valve with this appendage defies the fundamental laws of biomechanics." "Carter, look at his lower extremity," Hayes interrupted, her voice trembling. She was looking at his right thigh. The cauterized burn was a ghastly charred crater. The human had literally cooked his own flesh to seal a ruptured artery. The localized tissue death is severe, Hayes continued, scanning the wound with a handheld diagnostic wand. But the artery is sealed. The bleeding has stopped. If he had not performed this barbaric act, he would have bled to death within 4 minutes. Carter moved to the arm. We need to remove this adhesive material to reconstruct the bone structure. I will apply a localized solvent. He sprayed a clear chemical foam over the duct tape. Nothing happened. The industrial adhesive, designed to withstand the vacuum of deep space and micrometeorite impacts, ignored the alien medical solvent entirely. It is not degrading, Carter said, a note of genuine panic creeping into his tone. The chemical bonds of this tape are stronger than his epidermis. We have to cut it, Hayes said. Carefully. If we pull, we will deglove the entire forearm. They worked in tense, excruciating silence. They used microlasers to slowly, agonizingly peel the heavy tape away from the swollen, bruised flesh. Every time the laser clipped a nerve cluster, the unconscious human twitched violently, his heart rate spiking on the monitors. His nervous system is still firing, Hayes noted, injecting another dose of their strongest synthetic analgesic into Cole's IV line. I have given him enough sedative to render a Krellian pack beast comatose. His brain chemistry is actively fighting the chemical intrusion. Carter finally freed the wrench. It hit the metal tray with a heavy bloody clatter. He looked at the mangled arm, then up at the readouts. His species evolved on a Class 9 Deathworld, Carter said quietly. A biosphere designed to kill them at every turn. Predators, extreme weather, microscopic pathogens. They did not survive by being the strongest, Hayes. They survive because their bodies treat injury not as a systemic failure, but as a temporary inconvenience to be ignored until safety is secured. He picked up a boneweaver tool, its tip glowing with a soft, restorative blue light. They are biologically programmed for defiance. Over the next 4 hours, they rebuilt him. They used synthetic calcium grafts to piece the shattered radius and ulna back together, wrapping the bones in a microscopic lattice of titanium alloy thread. They excised the dead, charred flesh from his thigh, filling the crater with a biosynthetic dermal gel that would mimic muscle tissue until his own cells regenerated. Through it all, Cole's body fought them. His temperature spiked. His heart threw irregular, stubborn rhythms. His immune system attacked the sterile synthetic blood they pumped into his veins, forcing Hayes to constantly adjust the immunosuppressant drip. It was ugly, chaotic medicine. It was not the pristine, elegant healing the Aegis was known for. It was a brawl. When they finally finished, Cole lay bandaged and unconscious under a thermal blanket. His face was still pale, bruised around the eyes, but his breathing had deepened into a steady, natural rhythm. Hayes slumped against the wall, her hollow bones aching with exhaustion. He will survive. Carter nodded, staring at the human. Yes, but I do not understand why. The lights in the recovery ward did not buzz. Cole hated that. On the Ouroboros, you could gauge the station's health by the frequency of the fluorescent hum. Here, the silence was absolute, thick, and suffocating. It felt like being buried in cotton. He surfaced from the chemical dark in increments, fighting the heavy undertow of the sedatives. First came the smell. It was aggressively sterile, lacking the comforting ozone and stale sweat he associated with breathing recycled air. Then came the taste. His tongue felt swollen, coated in a film of sour chalk. He swallowed, and the dry scrape of his throat triggered a shallow coughing fit that sent a shockwave of dull, throbbing pressure down his left side. He cracked an eye open. The ceiling was a seamless expanse of pearl-white composite. Your cardiovascular rhythms are stabilizing, Mr. Bennett. The voice was synthesized, flat, and perfectly modulated, emanating from a small silver disc on the collar of the creature sitting next to his bed. Cole turned his head. It took a long, grueling second for his bruised brain to process the visual. The entity was tall, folded into an uncomfortable-looking crouch on a metal stool. It possessed the angular, chitinous geometry of a praying mantis, softened by a layer of fine, iridescent blue plumage that shimmered under the pale medical lights. It wore a pristine white harness. "Yeah," Cole rasped. He tested his jaw. It popped, a painful reminder of how hard he had clamped his teeth together against the wrench. "Where am I?" "You are aboard the medical frigate Aegis," the creature replied. "I am Dr. Carter. Do not attempt to elevate your torso. Your structural integrity remains severely compromised." Cole ignored the advice. He planted his right hand against the mattress. It felt like liquid gel shifting to perfectly cradle his weight, and pushed. The room tilted. Nausea, cold and slick, rolled through his stomach, but he locked his right elbow and forced himself upright. He looked down. He was wearing a thin, grey paper-like gown. His right thigh was heavily bandaged in a porous white material that smelled faintly of ammonia. His left arm was the main attraction. It was encased from shoulder to knuckles in a sleek metallic scaffold. Small rhythmic pulses of green light travelled along the struts, accompanied by a low, barely perceptible vibration that sank deep into his marrow. "Synthetic bone weaver," Carter explained, leaning forward. The alien's large, unblinking black eyes tracked Cole's every flinch. "Your radius and ulna were fractured in 4 distinct locations. The localized tissue destruction was catastrophic. We had to utilize microscopic titanium alloy threading to restructure your skeletal framework." Cole stared at the blinking lights. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel the profound gratitude of a survivor pulled from the brink. He felt a cold, familiar dread settling heavily in his gut. He let his head fall back against the pillow. "Who is footing the bill for the titanium?" Carter's head tilted. The blue feathers at the nape of his neck ruffled. A gesture the translator matrix didn't explain, but Cole read as confusion. "The Wayland-Yutani mining conglomerate maintains an emergency retainer with our vessel. The intervention is catalogued under your employment insurance." A dry hacking laugh tore out of Cole's chest, ending in a wince as the muscles in his burned thigh contracted. "Insurance, right. Until the claims adjusters get the telemetry, they'll pull the logs, see the primary servo motor burned out, and claim I applied improper torque prior to the failure. It'll be classified as operator error. Watch." Carter stood up, his multi-jointed legs clicking softly on the deck plating. Another alien, slightly shorter and wearing a grey diagnostic vest, stepped quietly into the room. Dr. Hayes. She clutched a transparent datapad, her mandibles twitching in a rhythmic, nervous cadence. "Mr. Bennett," Carter said, the synthesized voice attempting and failing to convey disbelief. "You suffered a level of traumatic agony that would have induced fatal neural cascading in a Krellian shock trooper. You knowingly mutilated your own muscular tissue, utilizing a shattered limb as a mechanical fulcrum to prevent a thermonuclear detonation. You saved 312 lives and a multi-billion credit infrastructure." Carter stepped closer, looming over the bed. "Why are you inquiring about bureaucratic loopholes?" Cole looked at the 2 aliens. They were looking at him the way a priest might look at a weeping statue, with a mixture of awe, reverence, and utter incomprehension. They had seen his biology. They had mapped his pain receptors. They thought he was a hero. "Because I have a mortgage, Doc," Cole said. His voice was quiet now, stripped of its sarcasm, heavy with the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who worked 60-hour shifts in a lightless tin can. He shifted his weight, his eyes drifting away from the aliens to stare at the blank white wall. "I have a 12-year-old daughter living in a cramped transit hab in New Chicago. She needs corrective dental braces next month. If I died, the company payout goes into an escrow account. The corporate lawyers were tied up in probate courts for 5 years while they investigate the explosion. My kid starves." He lifted his good hand, rubbing the rough, grimy stubble on his chin. "If I survived but let Sector 4 melt down, they fire me for gross negligence, strip my pension, and sue me for the damages to the refinery. I'd be in a debtor's prison on Mars before the burns healed." Hayes stepped forward, her dark eyes wide. "You did not endure the severing of your own flesh for the preservation of your pack, for the inherent glory of sacrifice." Cole let out a long, slow breath. "Glory doesn't pay the rent, lady. There's no glory in Sector 4, just rust, grease, and quotas." He looked down at his metallic, pulsating arm. The realization of what he had actually done was beginning to set in. The phantom sensation of the wrench grinding against his exposed bone made his stomach heave, but he forced the memory down into a dark, locked box in his mind. He couldn't afford PTSD. Therapy wasn't covered. "I didn't do it to save the station," Cole said, his tone hardening into a cynical edge. "I did it because if I didn't, Miller, my shift supervisor, would have blamed the coolant leak on my maintenance logs. And I genuinely, fundamentally despise Miller. I wasn't going to let that suit-wearing corporate prick win." Carter and Hayes exchanged a long, complex look. They communicated silently for a moment, a rapid exchange of microclicks and pheromone shifts. They had studied human evolution. They understood the dense bones, the efficient lungs, the terrifying adrenal response. But they had entirely missed the psychological component. Humans weren't just biologically resilient. They were psychologically forged in the fires of crushing unfair systems. They had weaponized their own spite. They didn't survive because they were noble or unkillable. They survived because they stubbornly refused to give a hostile universe the satisfaction of defeating them on a technicality. "Your species is a walking contradiction," Carter finally said, his translator struggling to find the right inflection. "We're stubborn, underpaid idiots," Cole corrected. He gestured with his chin toward the bedside console. "Hey, does that terminal have a subspace routing capability?" "It is equipped for long-range, high-bandwidth communication, yes," Hayes answered cautiously. "Do you wish to contact your offspring? We can secure a private frequency." "Later," Cole said. He reached out with his right hand, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the glass interface. "First, I need to call Miller. I need him to see that I'm breathing, and I need to tell him to his face that I'm taking my accumulated sick days. All 14 of them." He tapped the screen, keying in the archaic 10-digit routing code for the Wayland-Yutani Administrative Hub. "Oh," Cole added, pausing before his finger hit the green connection icon. He glanced back at Carter. "Can I get some actual water? Not the chemical slurry in the IV, and a cigarette, if you guys allow smoking in the triage bay." Carter watched the bruised, half-reconstructed human willingly prepare to engage in a high-stress administrative conflict mere hours after nearly dying. The avian alien let out a soft, whistling sigh that transcended language barriers. "I will procure hydration, Mr. Bennett. However, the combustion of toxic foliage is strictly prohibited within the sterile confines of this vessel." Cole scowled. "You guys have terrible bedside manner." As the comms screen chimed and connected, displaying the startled, aggressively annoyed face of a middle management corporate supervisor sitting behind a mahogany desk, Hayes turned to Carter. "They are terrifying," she whispered in their native tongue, a series of rapid clicks that bypassed the translator entirely. "They are monsters of endurance." Carter watched Cole lean toward the screen. The human ignored the sudden, frantic beep of his heart monitor. His voice immediately adopted a harsh, demanding volume, drowning out the supervisor's initial questions. "No, Hayes," Carter replied softly, watching Cole forcefully dictate the terms of his medical leave to the man on the screen. "They are survivors, and I pity anything in this galaxy, be it a collapsing star or a corporate entity, that tries to stand in their way. If Cole's stubborn, spite-fueled refusal to die on company time got your heart pounding, don't leave this story behind. Hit that like button to support more gritty, grounded HFY Sci. Share this video with a friend who knows the true power of sheer human stubbornness, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next journey into the dark, relentless corners of the galaxy. See you in the next one.